Hey guys, Sarek here, and today I'm bringing you my Altergeist deck profile for Yu-Gi-Oh! On a Budget. This is a really cheap control deck that focuses on using lots of powerful traps and their monsters' disruptive effects to prevent your opponent from making their plays. So, we have 3 copies of Altergeist Multifaker. Multifaker, if you activate a trap card, lets you special summon itself from your hand, and then you can special summon an Altergeist monster from your deck. So, that's really, really useful. Obviously, the deck is trap-based, so you can bring it out very, very easily, and it gives you more board presence, more disruption, and allows you to make Hextio with just 1 card. It's also really, really good because it activates in a separate chain, which I'll talk about later when you activate, when I talk about the trap cards. We then have 3 copies of Altergeist Meliseek. This is the most expensive component of the main deck. We have, it can attack directly, and when it inflicts battle damage, you get to target a card and send it to the graveyard, so it gets around things with destruction protection. And then, if it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add an Altergeist monster from your deck to your hand, so that includes if you link it off into, say, a Linkaribo. So, very, very good. It's a perfectly fine normal summon to set up the rest of your plays and go from there. We then have 3 copies of Altergeist Marionetta. If Marionetta's normal summoned, you get to set an Altergeist trap straight from your deck, which is obviously very, very useful. And if you can target one Altergeist card you control and an Altergeist monster, send the card on the field to the graveyard and special summon the monster from your graveyard. So it essentially switches their place. It's really good because it can send, obviously, spent traps. It can send monsters. You can obviously send a Meliseek to get Meliseek's effect and bring back something like a multifaker. And then, obviously, you'd get multifaker's effect to special summon something from your deck, and so on. It's very, very useful for setting up the exact board you need for the situation. We then have 2 copies of Altergeist Silquitus. This allows you to return Altergeist cards you control to the hand and then bounce 1 card your opponent controls. Obviously, it can't bounce itself, but it can bounce traps, which is obviously, again, very, very useful for dodging targeted removal on your traps, and just, again, another form of interruption of your opponent's plays, or things like putting Multifaker back in your hand so you can use its effect again when you activate a trap. And then, if it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you can target a trap in your graveyard and add that card to your hand. So again, it's another way you can link this off into an Almirage or into one of your Altergeist links and immediately get back a spent copy of Manifestation or Protocol. Then finally, we have 1 copy of Altergeist Konkiri. We only really need 1 because it's probably the worst Altergeist monster. It allows you to negate attacks, and then if it's special summoned, you can target a face-up card your opponent controls, and then negate its effect. Importantly, it allows you to negate the effects of cards, not monsters, so you can negate spells and traps with this. So that's the main Altergeist count. It's fairly slim. It is just 12 Altergeist monsters. So now we get on to the hand traps. We have 3 copies of Effect Veiler. This deck has very limited interaction with monster effects, and because of this we struggle to out cards with very, very powerful effects. So this is one way of preventing those from hitting the board in case of things like Dragoon, or just stopping important starters going off. In an ideal world, this would be infinite impermanence, but that is obviously far too expensive for us to use. We then have 3 copies of Skullmeister. This lets you obviously negate any card effect that activates in your opponent's graveyard, so any things like Sky Strikers trying to bring back their copies of Ray, things like Ben 10 effect, adding to hand, any of those frustrating effects that activate in the graveyard, you can negate those. I wasn't sure what to put in here. I was originally going to put Droll and Lockbird in here, but that is unfortunately an incredibly expensive card now. That's gone up to nearly 12 £15 a copy. It's the same price as an Ash Blossom, which is why I went for Skullmeister instead. But this could be any hand trap you have. Tailor it to your meta. We then have 3 copies of Pot of Desires. Now, this, in an ideal world, again, would be Extravagance or Prosperity. Again, they're way out of our budget for this deck. Pot of Desires is a fine replacement in this deck because multifaker is no longer at 1. If multifaker was still at 1, I would probably choose not to run this because you would be too much at risk of banishing multifaker. But other than that, you know what this card does. Banish 10 off the top, draw 2 cards. So now into the traps. We have 3 copies of Personal Spoofing. Personal Spoofing allows you to is a themed almost card trader for Altergeist. It allows you to shuffle an Altergeist card from your hand or field into the main deck and then search an Altergeist monster. It gets you exactly the card you need. It gets rid of dead copies of traps like Protocol or Altergeists you don't want in your hand. It's fantastic. It lets you shuffle them from the field or the hand so you can use it to dodge targeted removal. And it's just an all-round really, really good card. It's just a shame it's not an Altergeist card. But it would probably be too good if it were, because then it would be searchable with Marionetta. We then have 2 copies of Altergeist Protocol. This is the card that makes people hate Altergeist. Altergeist Protocol says, the activation and effects of Altergeist cards activated on your field cannot be negated. So it just says no. And then when your opponent activates a monster effect, you can send a face-up Altergeist card you control to the graveyard, negate the activation, and destroy it. This is a fantastic card. It's the card that makes Altergeist such a good control deck, because it just enables so many different situations where your opponent is struggling to play. We then have 1 copy of Altergeist Manifestation. This is a themed monster reborn. You can obviously do things like bouncing this with Silquitus and so on. And you can recur it with cards like Silquitus as well. We have 3 Torrential Tribute. Sometimes you just got to blow up the field. And important to note, because of the way multifaker's worded, you can activate Torrential Tribute, declare you're activating multifaker's effect, Torrential Tribute will blow up the field, and then multifaker will summon itself in a separate chain afterwards. So that's just important to know. And it's the same with things like counter traps and so on. You can always declare you're activating multifaker's effect. We've got 1 Dogmatic Punishment, because sometimes you just need to blow up something specific, and you don't want to blow up the entire field. We don't use the extra deck that much, so we can run it. I chose to just run 1, mainly for a cost problem, and we do actually want to go into Hextia relatively often. So now we get to run 4 copies of Imperial Order. Or rather, 3 copies of Anti-Spell Fragrance and 1 copy of Imperial Order. Sky Striker has come back. These cards say no. Prank Kids is quite popular. These cards say no. Drytron likes to activate lots of spell cards. These cards say no. Salamangreat likes to search a lot with things like Signet Mining, Pot of Desires, and Salamangreat Circle, Will, and Sanctuary. These cards say no. Lots of spell-based decks at the moment. These cards say no. If you flip one of those against Sky Striker early on and they don't have a Cosmic or a Twin Twisters to chain to it, you will just win the game. Then finally, we have 3 copies of Solemn Judgment, because, again, sometimes you just need to say no. And 3 copies of Solemn Strike, for when saying no with Solemn Judgment isn't good enough. So that's the main deck, and now we'll get onto the extra deck. The extra deck is incomplete because a lot of the cards that would go in the extra deck are cards that you would play if you were playing Extravagance or Prosperity. So they're cards you don't expect to use a lot of the time, and B, they're cards that are relatively expensive, so they're cards like Relinquished Anima, Selene, Access Code Talker. You've all heard the jam before. So I've decided we've got a bit of an incomplete extra deck here, but feel free to bulk it out with whatever cards you want. We have 3 copies of Altergeist Hextia. This is how you win the game. 2 Altergeist monsters gains attack equal to the original attack of Altergeist monsters it points to. When a spell, trap, card, or effect is activated, you contribute to the Altergeist monster this card points to, negate the activation, and if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, add 1 Altergeist card from your deck to your hand. This gives you ability to push for damage, which the Altergeist monsters lack because they have relatively low attack. It gives you spell and trap negation, and it gives you searching for any card you need in the deck. It's really, really good. And it's a generic 2 for the archetype. All the monsters we run are Altergeist monsters. We then run 1 copy of Altergeist Primer Banshee, which is link 3. You can tribute an Altergeist monster, special summon 1 from your deck to the zone it points to, and then if it's sent from the field to the graveyard, target an Altergeist card in your graveyard, add it to your hand. We don't make this very often, but it's nice to have and the ability to just, again, trade into any Altergeist monster we need from the deck. And then a bit more recursion for cards like Manifestation and so on. So now we get onto the honorary Altergeist monsters. We have 1 copy of Linkuriboh and 1 copy of Salamangreat Almirage. These are just your generic link ones, so you can activate your Melee-Seek effect and your Silquitous effect without needing to minus yourself, essentially. Linkuriboh is obviously only really usable with Melee-Seek, so you use it for that. Almirage is mainly for Silquitous. They do the same thing, they're just relatively generic link ones that have nice defensive effects that you can use. We have 1 Nightmare Phoenix. This one's in German because I don't know where my ultra-rare English copy's gone. Discard a card, destroy a spell and trap on the field. You know what Nightmare Phoenix does. It's a really, really valuable card to have. 1 Nightmare Unicorn, because, again, sometimes you just need to get rid of a card on the field that you can't get rid of other ways. 1 Borreload Dragon. This is our Dragoon out. If we can't stop the Verte, we need to somehow out Dragoon, and this is the way we can out it. By just attacking into Dragoon, you can just steal it and go there. Then finally, we have our Dogmatica Punishment targets. We have 1 Elder Entity Intus. You know what this does. If it's sent to the graveyard, you get to target a card on the field and destroy it. And then we have 1 copy of 5-headed Link Dragon for anyone who's still playing Infinitrack Megaclops. And it's just a 5k monster that we can send, because Dogmatica Punishment can only destroy cards with less attack than the monster you send. So that's why we play this one. It could be any monster with 4000 attack or greater. It could be a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, it could be a Dragon Master Knight, it could be a 5-headed dragon, it could be 5-headed Link Dragon. Doesn't matter, just any monster with a ridiculously high attack value. Anyway, that is the deck. For upgrades, you've all heard it before, Extrav, Prosperity, and Impermanence are almost must-haves for this deck. A copy of Selene is obviously excellent in the extra deck, as is an Access Code Talker. Again, just another way to end games. Ningirsu, the World Chalice Warrior, is a link 3 that outs Dragoon. So that's another card you could look into. It's not too expensive. I just don't have a copy myself. And other than that, the deck is very, very controlling. It may not be your cup of tea. It almost certainly won't be any friends you play with's cup of tea. But if you enjoy it, I hope you do. That'll be all from me. I've got some really, really spicy deck profiles coming up over the next few weeks, so I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.